A meeting to negotiate a peace deal in Ukraine is happening in Saudi Arabia between senior U.S. and Russian officials. Not represented is Ukraine or any European counterparts. The shift on U.S. on Ukraine is marking a major shift in U.S. policy by reversing Russia's isolation on the world stage and restoring dialogue between the two countries. European leaders fear they're going to lose their place at the negotiation table and what a solution without them would look like. To break this down for us, I'm joined this morning by George Beebe. He's Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute and a former CIA Director for Russia Analysis. Good morning.
Good morning.
President Trump recently called this meeting a first step. What would have been the discussion points this morning?
Well, I think what U.S. diplomats are discussing with the Russians is the broader U.S.-Russian relationship, changes in the world order, and our respective visions for what that order ought to look like. Those are foundational issues between Washington and Moscow. They're critical to establishing stability in the world. And I think they're an important signal for Washington to send to Moscow that we're not looking for Russia's strategic defeat, as many Western officials have called for, that we see a role for Russia in the world order, an important role, as a counterbalance to China, among other things. And this also sends a signal to the Russians that we do want a peace deal over Ukraine and that we recognize that the war is about more than just bilateral issues between Ukraine and Russia. There's also a geopolitical dimension about Europe's security architecture and Russia's role within it. So I think it's an important signal to send to the Russians.
Ukrainian President Zelensky has repeated there can be no solution without Ukraine's input. What then can be accomplished in this dialogue with just U.S. and Russia?
Well, I think this is a sequence of negotiations because this war has multiple dimensions. Part of this is about relations between the United States and Russia, and that's something that the United States has to talk to Russian officials about. Part of it is about issues between Ukraine and Russia. And that's an area where the Ukrainians will play a role. I have no doubt. They're not being cut out altogether. I think they're not playing a significant role in this initial sequence of negotiations, but that will set a context in which Ukraine and Russia can talk constructively about bilateral issues later.
We've talked about this being a departure from, from typical U.S. policy. What stands out to you then when you see these two parties meeting, the players at the table, who is and who isn't there?
Well, I think this is the right group of people to be discussing the issues that are at stake in all of this. And I think it sends a message that President Trump understands the broader context of this war, that it does have a lot to do with the changing world order, Russia's role in it, and the relationship between Russia and the United States in that context. That's really the only way we're going to get peace in Ukraine. If we leave the Ukrainians to negotiate with the Russians one-on-one, the Russians have a lot of structural advantages that they can use as leverage in those talks. American leverage comes in talking about these broader issues. The architecture in Europe, the broader relationship between the United States and Russia, that's where we can bring pressure to bear on the Russians, and that will allow, I think, a more constructive settlement in the Ukrainian war.
European leaders met in Paris. We know this was a security summit. They were discussing military capacity, what role they'll play in Ukraine. It ended in tears from the host after citing that, after hearing J.D. Vance's speech, that they no longer share a common ground with the U.S. What message is Trump sending to Europe by engaging directly with Russia first?
Well, I think what he's saying to the Europeans is you're going to have to step up. The United States needs a strong and effective Europe in order to play a role as one of those poles in this evolving multipolar world order. But to be strong, Europe has to not only step up militarily, to increase its own military industry production, but it also has to be strong politically. And I think that was the message that J.D. Vance was sending in Munich. Europe needs to live up to its own democratic ideals. not to be afraid of dissent, not to be afraid of opposition, but to recognize that's part of a strong democratic system. When Europe does that, it does have the ability to be a significant player in the world order. And I think the United States wants to see that.
George Beebe, Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute and former CIA Director for Russia Analysis. Thank you for your time. Great to have your input.
Thank you.
If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.